For the same reason, you can't abstract it out of the history of the United States, which has led some historians, most notably Steve Hahn recently, to argue that instead of seeing just the South as a slave society, and this is drawing, as you mentioned in lecture, on Moses Finley's distinction between a society with slaves and a slave society where slaves are sort of the essence, the heart of the matter. Hahn would argue that not just the South, but the United States as a whole is a slave society circa 1860.
Right, yes, he's made a strong argument in some of his books, and I think there's good reason to make that argument. Personally, I've become less and less impressed by the distinction between a slave society and a society with slaves, certainly in the American case, because as we said, the American slave system is so deeply embedded in the world, in a world slave system in the 18th century, that, you know, even let's say a colony like New York, which has slavery, no question, but not as much as in the South, but nonetheless, it's selling goods to the West Indies, it's shipping slave products, it's very tied in to a slave economy, whether the slaves in New York are the essence of the economic system or not. So yes, I think Hahn's, and you can go back to Fehrenbacher, the Slaveholding Republic, which is an argument that the national government in this long period before the war is fundamentally pursuing the interests of slave owners, with a few exceptions, but basically that's what they're doing. So yes, the Mason-Dixon line is not a hard and fast barrier or boundary between slavery and lack of slavery. The people who who experience this the most are fugitive slaves. Yeah. You can run away from the South, but you can't run away from slavery if you're in New York. You know, I'm writing a little book about this now, so it's been on my mind. There was a jurist in New York in one of these cases in the 1830s who said, well, you know, as long as the fugitive slave law or the clause is in the Constitution, slavery exists in New York. No, New York has abolished slavery, and yet slavery still exists in New York because the laws of the southern states carry into New York through the fugitive slave clause of the Constitution, and after 1850 through a very draconian federal law. So I guess you'd say, well, Malcolm X said this much more recently. The boundary between North and South is the Canadian border, On the other hand, I think there is a problem with homogenizing North and South. Yes, racism was deeply embedded in the North. Yes, the North was complicitous in slavery all the way through, and yet African Americans and others anybody had more leeway in the northern states. Abolitionists had more leeway. There was more space to challenge the slave system than existed below the Mason-Dixon line. So I think you don't want to just create a homogenized America where slavery is equally powerful and equally present north, south, east, and west.